Welcome, fellow beekeepers. This is Jamie Walters, your live webinar training host. I'm pleased to share this educational webinar in hopes to make you a better beekeeper. Live sessions are now recorded on the fourth Sunday of each month at 7 o'clock p.m. through Zoom conference call. You're welcome to reserve a ticket at www.eventbrite.com. Search for Ohio State Beekeepers Association's events and click Tickets. Register by filling in your name and email address, and a confirmation email will be sent to you with a Zoom link. Each training session is recorded and posted on OSBA's YouTube channel. You're welcome to subscribe and be sure to click the bell to be alerted each time we upload a new video. Each month's speaker and presentation will be posted on OSBA's Facebook page and on our website at ohiostatebeekeepers.org. You're welcome to subscribe to the live webinar training news group to be alerted at the beginning of each month. If you have any questions, please feel free to contact us at live-webinar-training@ohiostatebeekeepers.org. And now on to our previous recorded webinar. I want to welcome Mr. Dana Stahlman.
Thank you, Jamie. I have lived in Ohio for 75 years. I've been in North Carolina now for 6. And beekeeping is still in my blood. I was born in Van Wert, Ohio. Grew up in Paulding County for quite a while. Went to Defiance College, which is there in your neighborhood, Jamie. And I don't know whether it was a blessing or not, but I was born into a commercial beekeeping family, knew the Stollers quite well. And here at 82, I'm still kicking. So the question really comes up when we start talking about honeybees is, why are our bees dying? And it's affecting everybody. I don't care where you live, but COVID has been challenging, and a lot of people are comparing the problems we have with COVID. There are a lot of research papers done, there's journals, but in reality, the problem facing all of us is really, how do we keep our honeybees alive? I'm not sure I can tell you how to do it. In the United States, I've been a commercial beekeeper. I used to transport bees from Ohio to Georgia. I've had them into Arkansas. And some of the problems that we have are facing commercial beekeepers very seriously in the United States. And I'll bring that up a little bit later on. But most of you are hobby beekeepers. And without hobby beekeepers, we wouldn't have too many hives of bees in the United States. Norman E. Gary, I don't know how many of you know him, but he's been around for a long, long time. And he estimated that there's 300,000 hobby beekeepers in the United States. I don't know where that figure came from, but I think there's a lot more than that. Taking Central Ohio, I was the president of the Central Ohio Beekeepers at one time. We used to have bee meetings and bee schools with maybe 30 people showing up for a full session. By the time we got to 2006, we were looking at about 75 people per bee school, and then we started adding several classes because we just couldn't handle 75 people in a single room. So I know here in North Carolina, I live in Raleigh, and this is Wake County. Their bee school is sold out every year. They draw the line at 80 people. And, 80 people in a class is just too many to really teach beekeeping. So here we go. The question is, what can we do about keeping our bees alive? Surveys right now are indicating that we're facing around 40% loss every year. And everybody I run into wants to know, what can I do, about that? This includes me. Weather has a lot to do with bees surviving. Here in Raleigh, I'm hearing some of you talk about inches of snow. I don't have a snow shovel. I don't have a pair of gloves. I have to worry more about ice than I do snow. And for example, I don't know what you're calling for in a couple of days, but our weather reports, we're going to have 60-degree weather come middle of this week. So let's talk about February, winter in Ohio, or any place else you might be. I have a tremendous book collection, and this is valuable because I can look back to the 1960s. Actually, I started keeping bees in 1949. When I say keeping bees, I was around bees way before that. But as far as having my own bee yard, I had 10 hives in an orchard. When I became a ninth grader in high school. If you'll take a look at this chart that's on your screen, the yellow lines talk about winter and the number of hives lost, the percentage that was turned into the U.S. Department of Agriculture. And if you take a look at Ohio, you'll see that the percent loss in the spring of 1958, 1959, that loss was around 40 or 24%. And it has been a fact that generally the North has more bee losses than those people in the southern states. That's one reason when I was keeping bees commercially, I took bees from Ohio, took them to Georgia, southern Georgia, because there is a big difference between northern Georgia and southern Georgia. And wintered my bees, shook package bees, raised queens, and then in the spring, around April, would be returning to Ohio with package bees for my customers. Now, in 1958, 24% loss in Ohio wasn't really all that unusual. I don't know, a lot of people talk about the wonderful days of beekeeping back in the 1960s. I can tell you that people had, if you had 10% loss, you were doing good. If you were normal, you normally would say, okay, in this bee yard of 10 hives of bees, maybe I'm going to lose 3 or 4 of them. Today, it looks like you're going to lose 4 out of 10, or maybe 5 out of 10 or more. If you look at the northeast central area of the United States, which includes Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Michigan, and Wisconsin, they ran an average of 23% in 1958. So if somebody tells you that there were no losses back then, don't believe them. So what's causing bees to die? It's always been, especially in the north, the stress of the winter cluster. Winter clusters are really unique. I stress all the time, bee population, bee population, bee population. People are doing what they're supposed to do. They read their bee books, they go to their bee schools, they're told about how to do windbreaks, preparing their bees for winter, make sure they have good ventilation, make sure they have food. We talk about applying mite treatment. And boy, I'll tell you, that's a big problem for me because I don't know what to tell a new beekeeper what you should treat with. There are so many things being used today with various results. And we're still working at it, a lot of research going on, and we're finding a lot of things that we really didn't know before. it's surprising how many new beekeepers blame themselves for bee losses. They're saying, why did my bees die? I should have done this. I should have done that. I mentor 5 people every year, by the way. And because I do that, I stay in touch with what many people are running into. I took this from a commercial. We see it. We all see it. My hive died. Well, the number one reason can be attributed to the Varroa mite. We found out, or we were taught for a long time, that the bees provided blood food for the mites, but that's not true. We have found that fat bodies are the food for mites, and the fat bodies are very important because they store the energy for honeybees. What you're looking at on the screen is the bottom of a hive. Most of you that have screen bottom boards, you slide that little white board. It's just a thin board, something like you see at these on these political yard signs. Slide that in under the screen bottom board. Well, this happens to be a hive that had one of those types of white bottoms. And if you look at this, you will see, I don't know whether you can see my cursor on the screen, but you will see plenty of mites in this picture. And this hive, the next picture is going to demonstrate this even more. These are the bees that produced that bottom board, which had a lot of mites on it. When you look at the debris at the bottom of a bottom board, you can sure tell a lot about a beehive that has died. This cluster of bees was still in that hive. And this cluster, you'll see the queen, she's right here. And this hive did not die of starvation. You say, oh, sure, there's just so few bees. This bee died because the hive did not have that winter cluster that it needed to survive. This hive didn't survive because Varroa mite killed it. And we see a lot of this in hives that we open right now. And we go to our bee yard and we open a hive, we'll see maybe a little cluster of bees like this. And another characteristic of looking at a hive killed with mites, often in the early fall, is there just no bees left in the hive. Okay, at this time of the year, here in Raleigh and up there in Columbus and Ohio, bees are in your winter cluster. Queens down here start laying eggs as early as Christmas. I checked some of my hives the day after Christmas and found some small brood clusters, but they were there. The further south you go, egg laying begins earlier and it is delayed, but by the time you get up to Lake Erie or that area, by March, you've got a little bit of brood that has been necessary because that brood is your survivor brood. It's the brood that's raised in the fall of the year. Those bees that were raised in the fall of the year are dying now, and they will be gone very shortly. But the new bees that are in that cluster, this winter cluster being raised, those new bees are going to be the lifeblood of a new colony. I have a couple of things here that I'd like to point out with bee activity in late winter. A cluster of bees in winter generates its own heat. They have to. They need that bee fat in order to survive and be strong. If mites work on a hive, they weaken the bees, shorten their lives, stress them. Survival depends on having healthy young bees to replace the dying bees, food resources, and a dry nest with good ventilation. Those are nothing new. Langstroth pointed that out. way back in 1853. Weak hives, if we open up our hives now, I don't think you guys in Ohio with 10 inches of snow are going to be doing this, but down here, we have had a chance with some days where temperatures are in the 60s to open our hives, and in many cases, we're finding very weak hives. Winter is not over. We are looking at maybe combining weak hives. We're talking about replacing queens, but you know, queens are not available right now. So if we're going to save a weak hive, we have to depend on bee management to help a colony survive. And bee management basically is making sure they have the food. If they are very, very weak, we have to make a lot of decisions. What are we going to do? Are we going to let them die, or are we going to try to save them? Many hives that have died because Varroa mites, but there's other things we're dealing with, like the viruses. I've seen paralyzed bees. I see bees crawling on the ground in front of a hive. I know something's going on besides the Varroa mite. Those days when we could keep bees without treating them with whatever methods we're using, those days are over. It's just too expensive to lose a bunch of hives of bees. And by the way, I just heard a story out of Georgia yesterday about a commercial beekeeper who lost 600 to 800 hives. He was taking his hives to almond pollination. He just didn't have 600 to 800 hives to take on semis out there. He took some. I don't know how many of you have seen on the screen right now are some bees that have been affected by viruses. I'm not an expert on viruses. You can't see these things with your naked eye. And so I've had to depend on going to Penn State's website. And I can remember sac brood. I can remember seeing very, very little of it. I don't get into a large number of hives anymore, so I'm not sure just how often we do see sac brood. But we have tools today, scanning electron microscopes. We have the ability to look at DNA. And of course, the science that we're reading indicates to us that even in bees that don't look injured at all, they act very normal, that they do have traces, and they're finding examples of these viruses, and who knows how many more different viruses. Penn State talks about 20 different viruses. All I can say to you is COVID is teaching us a lesson. Wash your hands. Separate yourself by some distance between other people. And I'm going to apply some of that to talking about the stress factors on honeybees, because there are two people that I've really read and followed for a long time. One is Tom Seeley from Cornell, and Tom has written a book. I'm going to hold it up just a second where if you see my face, but this book is one that I think all of you should be taking a look at. It's not too expensive, but it's The Lives of Bees. And Tom Seeley says there's no distinct breed of honeybees in the United States. And yet we talk about breeds of bees all the time. He shows a picture in his book which shows samples of bees taken before 2010 and samples of bees taken after 2010. And what he found is our bees are so interbred that the DNA of the ancestry of these bees is present in almost any bee that you would buy. It's also present in the feral bees that we find. And Tom Seeley, as far as I'm concerned, I'm looking for my clicker here. Tom Seeley has done a lot of work. He points out that we see variations in honeybees. We see color. We see maybe some body part differences, wings and things of that sort. And we see maybe behavior problems, mean bees, gentle bees, but we do not see distinct breeds of honeybees. The ancestry of our bees goes back to the European honeybee. And in that little chart that's in Tom's book, it clearly points out that there are traces of the black bee, the German black bee, in our honeybees today. Points out that the bees that were imported in the United States in the 1880s through the 1890s are still there, some in some small faction. And even in the bees that are collected in swarms in the Ithaca area of New York, some of those wild bees are even showing some genetics from the Africanized honeybee. If you're looking for a good book to read, I don't get anything recommending it, but certainly that is a very good book. Another thing I found from Tom Seeley's book, he did a lot of work with swarms, catching swarms, things of that sort. And he draws a comparison between the wild bees and the bees that are managed by humans. And he found that wild bees generally do survive when their density is low. For example, 1 swarm per a square mile. That's the figure he pointed out in his book. And they seem to survive. And from that observation, he points out 21 factors that contribute to the survival of wild bees versus those that are kept by beekeepers. And I'm just going to point out a few of them. Colonies live in crowded apiaries. COVID says, for the most part, keep 6-foot distance. What Tom Seeley has found, maybe we might need to keep our honeybees 1 mile distance. Colonies occupy large hives. Wild bees generally have a cavity in a tree, has rather thick surrounding wood protection, where most of our bees has 3/4 of an inch. The nest organization in managed hives is often altered. Colonies are frequently disturbed. Now, none of this happens to wild colonies. Colonies sometimes have artificial diets. Colonies are moved. We try to get rid of as much drone comb as we can. Beekeepers raise queens and they choose the larvae that they're going to graft. Many colonies are exposed to insecticides and fungicides. What I think Tom is referring to here is if you have bees and you have them close to a crop that is being sprayed by aerial spray or something like that, these people do not spray woods and forests, but they do spray a crop that a bee yard might be next to. And he does say something about the structure of our hives. Our hives usually do not have a propolis coating on the inside where a wild nest would have. Talks about nests being in managed hives close to the ground, where wild bees are usually well above ground. Our hives have thin walls. Bees in the wild have thick walls. And taking this kind of thinking into talking about how do we keep our bees alive, it's pretty obvious that people like me, I have 2 bee yards. I have one with 9 hives and one with 17, and they're on pallets usually 2 hives to a pallet, sometimes 3. And it's contrary completely to this COVID thing and the comments that Tom Seeley has made. So let's take a look at these things. Here in North Carolina, Dave Tarpey has issued a paper to us as beekeepers on how we might do something to deal with parasites like the mites. And he does the same thing. We're asked to wash our hands frequently with the COVID people. His suggestion, buy queens that have hygienic behavior. We're told to physically distance ourselves from each other. Tom Seeley has indicated increase the distance among hives to dramatically decrease the likelihood of drifting. So when we talk about stress factors, almost everything that I've mentioned causes stress. And when we add a lot of things together that cause stress, it's very difficult for a hive of bees to survive. Now let's look at Varroa mites just for a second. These are pictures that I took, believe it or not, in the late 1990s. I had a movie camera with me, and it shows a honeybee. This is in the left picture, but in the left slide under the arrow, you'll see a honeybee, and right above it, you'll see a Varroa mite. The arrow is almost on the Varroa mite. And then in the right picture, you will see that that honeybee has moved up and grabbed that mite, and with its mandibles has didn't chew it, but pulled it off of some of the white larvae that was exposed when I opened this hive, because you can see these mites real easy on drone larvae. But I was really surprised. I even had my camera with me to catch this because it is something that we don't usually see. But it did indicate to me that this hive of bees back in the 1990s had hygienic behavior. I'm sure all of you are well aware of what happened at the Capitol building, and that reminded me that this must be what it is like for a hive undergoing a robbing situation. I don't like to use political things here, and this is not really meant to be that way, but I couldn't think of a better way to describe robbing as making that comparison. We have always tried to prevent robbing, and robbing is a stress factor. We put robbing screens on hives. We isolate hives being robbed. We paint entrances to hives different colors to prevent drifting. We can take wet grass or mud or whatever it is that's handy and close up an entrance to a hive that's being robbed. But by the time you see a huge herd of bees flying around a hive, it's almost too late. The only thing I can suggest is quarantine hives with high nosema or Varroa levels. If you know you have a hive of bees in your bee yard with a lot of Varroa mites, I would get them out of there. If you can at all move bees to an isolation area, move the bees that have a lot of Varroa. And it's pretty easy to determine Varroa. You can do a sugar shake, or you can do an alcohol test. And I heard Jamie say something about the levels of mites. I kind of take it even a little step further. I don't count. If I see one, I've got a mite problem. And it's another comparison I can make. I just cleaned out supers in my storage shed, and I put together a number of nukes to raise queens this summer, and I had brand new foundation in these nukes. And if you read my newsletter, you saw pictures of what I found. I picked up a nuke and pulled the lid off of it, and I had mice going everywhere. If a person's a little bit jumpy and a little bit concerned about mice, I'm going to tell you something. I was dodging mice. They just were going everywhere. And I put out bait and I put out traps, but I'm not going to take care of those mice because once you see one, there's a whole bunch more behind them. Okay, we mentioned queens a little bit. People have complained about queens for years and years and years. Up where you guys live around Defiance, you're in the heart of beekeeping country. And it wasn't too unusual over there in Paulding County to get 200 pounds of honey per hive on average. That was in the 1960s and 1970s. And during that same period of time, Walter Rothenbuehler came to Ohio State and started working with the genetics on bees that would survive and be resistant to American foul brood. A lot of his work is still at Ohio State University, but I should point out to you that when the Ohio State University converted the Rothenbuehler Bee Lab to the extension services, ag extensions, much of the stuff that was in Rothenbuehler's Bee Lab was moved up to Worcester and stored in an old barn they had up there. And the tornado that went through there, I think in 2010, wiped that building out, and almost all of the stuff that was stored in there about Walter Rothenbuehler's research was gone. And I put this comment here. I hope I'm wrong, but in this statement. But if anything did survive, I would hope that Jim Tu or Dave Heilman still were able to recover some of it. And if you want to read about Walter Rothenbuehler and the work he did, there are some materials still available with the Ohio State University Bee Lab. Do you know queens used to be starlines, midnights? We had Larry Connors heavily involved with developing the starline queen and working for Data Ant. And you can't find those queens anymore. The Yugoslavian bee came along. It didn't last for very long. But we are working with hygienic bees, and I heard Jamie mention the Purdue project. It's important for beekeepers today. If you want to fight stress in one way, you can work on getting these mite-resistant queens. Queen failure. We're doing a lot of research trying to figure out what's happening. Sometimes we do it ourselves. How many of you have treated a hive with some form of chemicals or oxalic acid and found that the result was you were losing queens? You were getting rid of mites, but you were also losing queens. We need to ask questions about that topic. In the Ohio State newsletter, first quarter by Tom Rathburn, there's a very interesting article about oxalic acid, and I'd suggest that you might take a look at that. Queen failure, things that they're looking at: parasites, disease, pesticides, proper nutrition. That's a big stress factor, by the way, nutrition. How queens are being sold. There are queens coming out of large producers. We're talking about people who produce maybe 20,000 queens a year. Here in North Carolina, there's a resistance to buying package bees because of the queens that come in a package, because these queens seem to fail even before the season is over. But we're finding out that those queens are often affected by low sperm counts and low sperm viability. So even if you try to get started with a queen with a package of bees, I would say a beekeeper should replace that queen before fall, even late summer. What does a new beekeeper do? I would suggest beekeepers be encouraged to buy locally produced nukes, preferably with overwintered queens. We run into the same situation with a person who sells a nuke and they buy a queen from the south or any place, and they introduce a new queen into the nuke. The problem of a queen that may have this sperm viability problem being superseded or running out of sperm before the year is over with, or just declining and failing before the beekeeper even knows what's happening. I am sure that beekeepers in Ohio have the same feeling about imported queens as the people here in North Carolina. Another big stress, really big stress, is hive density. I live here in North Raleigh, and when I moved down here, I live in an HOA, and I started 2 hives of bees, hiding them in the shrubs and stuff around the house, because in an HOA, I was afraid my wife didn't know whether it's acceptable or not to have a couple hives of bees. I was thinking I was the only guy in this neighborhood that had bees. Lo and behold, I found 6 people in this neighborhood keeping bees, all within 2 miles of my hives. So the number 2 problem we have is hive density. Not only do we put our hives in rows in bee yards, put them on pallets, keep them close together, we don't have them spread out. It reminds me of COVID. My wife and I have isolated ourselves in our house. Fortunately, I have had that first COVID shot, but boy, I'm going to tell you, it's almost scary to go out and go shopping. Who knows who we're going to run across? And the same with honeybees. Honeybees are being exposed all the time by other bees. Like I said with Tom Seeley's book, we need to place our hives further apart. And I know most of you have hives that are pretty close together because that's pretty convenient. Okay, the number 3 stressor that I'm really thinking about is how we are spreading various pests, viruses, and genetics around the country. Back in the early I'd say late 1980s, there were books with articles about mites, tracheal mites, mention of Varroa mites. We talked about them being brought into the United States. Most of them were found first in Florida. And we were saying to ourselves, no problem. I live in Ohio. I don't need to worry about those things. Do you realize in 1 year we were worrying about them? But how did they get here? Well, we buy package bees. We buy nucleus hives. We have people pollinating bees traveling from warm areas to colder areas. There's a big pollination business in Ohio with apple trees and with pickles and pumpkins. And we're buying queens from many different sources. And we are just possibly spreading disease all over this country without even realizing what we're doing. We can't do much about it now because the cat is out of the bag. But I just want to point out, a change in any factor within a hive will result in stress on an entire colony, It doesn't stress just one bee, it stresses a lot of bees. And if we cannot find a solution for that stress, our hives are going to die. And 40%, even with people treating bees, seems to be somewhere where we're, actually looking at the reality of what is happening to beekeeping. I don't know whether you have noticed it or not, but people are paying $200 per hive for pollen pollination for almonds in California. I wonder why that is. We know why it is. It's because those people are having trouble getting bees. The number 4 stress factor that I really want to point out is the loss of bee habitat. I'm going to repeat that again, the loss of bee habitat. Some people don't even know what a fence row is anymore. Our farming practices have changed and changed a lot. We basically, in Ohio, we're down to corn, soybeans, and wheat. And many of our ditch banks and so forth, Paulding County, by the way, had a lot of drainage ditches, and they were filled with flowering pollen and nectar-bearing plants. Today, farmers still keep a little patch of ground so we don't get into erosion problems around those ditches. But for the most part, farmers now are farming every square inch of land that they can possibly turn into production. It means cutting down the woods, the forest that we have. And I'm not going to blame farmers. I live in Columbus, Ohio, for 25 years. And there are places in northern Franklin County that were farms at one time. Southern Delaware County, farms were there sometime. Eastern Franklin County, farms. I had 36 bee yards in the 3 or 4 counties surrounding Franklin County. I can't find almost a single bee yard that I had at one time. They're all houses. It's just disappeared. And that's not only Columbus, Ohio, it's almost everywhere. The only saving factor that we have as far as the nutrition is concerned is those people who are going out and planting and seeding areas with pollen producing plants. And fortunately, it has become a strong effort on the part of many areas to take land that is barren and reseeding it. This topic about nutrition and foraging plants, this is an editorial from a Gleanings in Bee Culture magazine from 1961, and an article by Carl Killian, he was a comb honey producer, indicated by 1961, the people in Illinois had gone from 15 million pounds of honey collected to 4 million pounds of honey collected in the past 30 years. That's 1930 to 1960. And he talks about beekeeping being unprofitable. This is something that started a long time ago as far as honey nutrition is concerned. I wonder how many commercial beekeepers you have still producing honey in Ohio. The Stollers, I remember my grandfather and my uncle and my dad, but all those people are gone. And unfortunately, many people are selling their bees. Our equipment, it's interesting for me. I was brought up with Langstroth hives, 10-frame hives, and there wasn't any other acceptable way of keeping bees. And living here in Raleigh and living in Ohio, We started working with top bar hives. We started working with the Langstroth long hive, which has become somewhat popular here in the Raleigh area. Big problem with me is I move my bees around, and it's pretty hard for me to move a hive that's got legs and is 30 frames of horizontal bees, but we have shifted from the Langstroth being an ideal hive because there are several other factors about the Langstroth hive that Tom Seeley points out. It's got thin walls. The bees go in close to the ground. I mean, the bees naturally fly higher, but with the Langstroth hive, they're forced to fly in maybe at best 24 inches off the ground. And we've introduced all kinds of plastics and chemicals into our hives. So again, being me, I am very frustrated with what I'm going to put into my hives and how I'm going to manage my hives. I've gone to single deeps for overwintering. Make sure that single deep in the fall of the year has a lot of honey. All the space that surrounds that. I know the bees heat their cluster. They don't heat the hive, but I have tried to reduce the amount of, reduce the amount of airspace, dead airspace that is around that cluster. Loss of a queen is a real issue with stress. My thoughts, I see a lot of new beekeepers and their queens are not even lasting the summer. A lot of people will, if you're working with people that have hives, you may be noticed that by midsummer, they become alarmed because their population is being, well, there's not as many bees in the hive as there was earlier. And you take a look and you see shotgun brood patterns and you see failing queens, and sometimes you see a colony with a egg-laying worker bee, and that can't help but reduce your chances of having a hive survive. This is just an example of a frame with some drone brood on it. I take pictures when I visit the people I mentor and people who ask me to help with questions, and I get an opportunity to take pictures of their frames. And they ask me, for example, in a situation like this, what can I do to save this hive of bees? There is no brood in it. There's just there's just drone brood, no worker brood at all. And invariably, in my management practices, I'd take a hive like this and set it on the strongest I have in the bee yard. The strongest hive I have in the bee yard will take care of any laying workers. And within a couple of weeks, I can split that hive back, add a new queen into it, and start it over if I want to save that hive. Other causes of stress. Our honeybees are not domesticated. They're wild, really. It would be nice maybe if somebody decided that they would like to work on developing a bee that did not sting, but had all the other qualities of our honeybee. I can remember Walter Rothenbuehler had a question for his students at Ohio State, what would be the ideal bee? And if somebody put down an answer, such as develop a bee that doesn't sting, they failed the class. But we manipulate bees to do what we want them to do, or what we think is best for them. Here's a good example. I had a student was feeding some bees, bought a top feeder, one of the plastic ones that fits into a super, and used a medium super instead of a shallow super. It was designed for a shallow super. And so they were feeding their bees. And when I was called out to look at the hive, we found all this comb full of honey built under the feeder. Wouldn't it have been wonderful if the bees had been able to store that in their hive rather than us more or less cutting this out and then laying it in a container so the bees could recycle the honey that's in this comb? Surely one of the problems that new beekeepers have later in the year is trying to get comb drawn out. This comb, the bees worked real hard on it, but as far as helping the colony of bees, we decided, okay, we'll cut this down and we'll have to get a shallow super for that feeder. I notice also that I have a tendency to do this, but I like to have clean top bars. If I find burr comb on my top bars, I have a bucket and I just usually scrape it into, take this burr comb and just scrape it into a bucket and recycle it. But all the work the bees do to create these ladders, especially between two hives, one with the top bars in the babbitt low, and then one with the top bars even with the top of a hive, and you got a big gap between the two boxes. We go in and we try to clean that mess up. That's doing a lot of damage to the honeybees. And I ask a question here, do you know what would happen if we took out one of these frames and did not return it to this hive? Honeybees would take care of that problem, I guarantee you. They would belt a frame of wax in there. Every time you pull a frame out of a hive, you run the chance of killing the queen. I think our management practices should always teach you start at the side of the hive, near one side, pull the outside frames, and then work your way toward the center if you're looking to check and inspect a hive. But I'm not perfect. And when we talk about how we manage our bees, I do these things. I manage my bees to prevent swarms. Maybe, as Tom Seeley suggests, swarming is good. The fact that the hive goes without brood for a period of time is a means of controlling the mites. I move my bees from one location to another, and I still do. I take away their honey. I still do. If I don't like their queens, I replace the queen. I've always had a rule. If I have to dress up for bees, put on gloves and everything else, the queen's dead. I place my beehives close together in the same apiary. I overpopulate the area with honeybees in my neighborhood. As a matter of fact, I overpopulate my bees in the bee yard. 17 hives of bees in one bee yard may be too many. I've got to rethink as I go into this next year, what am I going to do about this thing of distance between hives and that sort of thing? The worst thing, the mites are bad, but I don't know how many of you have had any problem with American foul brood. Used to be the bees were treated with terramycin. It didn't really cure the disease, it masked the disease, and we could get away without destroying the hive. But most bee inspectors, and I was a bee inspector in Delaware County for 3 years, we more or less encouraged people to burn the hives. My supervisor was Larry Van Tilburg, and Larry was really firm when it came to handling American foul brood. People oftentimes had 10 days after you told them they had foul brood to start doing something about it. With the state of Ohio back in the 1980s, there was a trial, between, I think it was in Madison County, a trial where a fellow had American foul brood, and this was affecting other beekeepers that lived around him. And the bee inspector came and burned his bees, and he filed a lawsuit as a result of it. That's the reason why Ohio has a no consent. Currently, if somebody like a bee inspector wants to come and inspect your bees, you have the legal right to ask for a second opinion. You've got due process involved, a hearing before anybody can come in and burn your beehives. But American foul brood is the most contagious disease that we have in the honeybee business. And the picture you see there is what I did with a hive at one time: dug a pit, put the beehive in it, and burned it. That's tough. It's hard to kill a hive of bees. Okay, let's look ahead. We're getting close to the end of this presentation. The reason we're losing bees: mite treatments are neglected, hives with poor queens are not requeened, we take too much honey from a hive at harvest time, and then we feed them back sugar syrup, replacing that honey. Sugar syrup in no way replaces honey as a good bee food. Give you a little bit of time to read this. Anytime we open a hive of bees, we're causing stress to that hive. When we move frames from one hive to another, we're being very disruptive. We're going to have to decide what we want to do as beekeepers. Maybe we might be looking at requeening in the fall as a regular process, putting our hives through a period of queenlessness, no eggs, no larvae in a hive to cut down on mites. There's strategies we can look at, and I think we need to look at some of those seriously. The last two slides coming up. I had a student this year who got the crap stung out of him. I mean, to the point that the beekeeper was thinking of quitting. And they wanted to know why the bees were so angry and defensive. And in talking to them, I found out a few days earlier when they examined her hive, we had a storm move through, something like what you see right here in this picture. All the older bees come back to a hive. They literally are defending a hive. They're sitting on the outside, waiting to nail somebody that opens that hive when it's weather like this. When they're out collecting food, foraging, and so forth, you don't have that problem. And most information will tell you this: anything new. Bees will react to weather conditions. They will react when there's no honey flow going on. We see bearded bees on the front of a hive. That really could set them off. Moisture inside of a beehive during the winter. We have a lot of rain going on in Raleigh right now, and I'm really worried about the amount of moisture that might be collecting inside of my hives. In Ohio, we had tornadoes. Down here, we got hurricanes. There's a big difference. I learned to take a concrete block and the ratchet straps and ratchet my bees down to the pallet with a cement block on top. At least if the hive got blown over, the ratchet strap would at least try to hold the hive together a bit. And I don't like hot weather. people talk about not having mite problems here in North Carolina a lot if you have your bees out in the open. My bee yard I have with the 17 hives is in the open. It's not in a woods or anything like that. The bee yard I have in my backyard is surrounded by trees. And I can tell the difference in what the bees are doing as far as mites and small hive beetle problems. And then there's us. We're human. I have a lawn care company that takes care of my lawn. I like a pretty lawn. My neighbors would complain if I had a field of dandelions or something like that. But we, as humans, like to have nice looking properties, and we like to get rid of all the weeds that might be growing around. So we spray. Farmers spray. We have pesticides used. We've got neighbors. I've got a neighbor next door that sprays for the mosquito, and there's not anything I can do about it. But when I know they're going to spray, I move bees. And as a beekeeper, all this brings stress on me as well. It brings stress on you because I'm not quite like a new beekeeper that wants to have a funeral for the queen when she dies, but I certainly am hit in the gut when I find a hive that has died. So that pretty much takes care of stress factors that I'm certainly dealing with. And if any of you have any questions, I'd be more than happy to address them for you. My address is here on the screen, and the newsletter that I put out comes out every Saturday or Sunday. It's actually dated for going out on Sunday, but it's free, and I can ramble and talk about bees and make myself feel like I'm doing something good. But this is available, and if any of you want to contact me, you can contact me at my email address and just say, add me to your list. And it's been a pleasure and an honor to be invited to give this presentation tonight. And Jamie, comments about Ohio State Beekeepers. You guys are doing a bang-up job in Ohio. Let me tell you, I'm proud of the work you're doing.
Thank you very much, sir. I'm going to leave it, Dane, or Mr. Stahlman's information up on the board just for a few more seconds. I got a couple questions for you.
Okay.
CK is asking, why has the Starlight strain disappeared?
I developed a line called Buckeye Bell and Buckeye Reb back in the 1990s. It doesn't exist anymore because in order to have any consistency raising queens, and I used artificial insemination. In fact, Joe Langstroth did some artificial insemination for me. And I tried to bring in stock such as the Minnesota Hygienic line and a few others. You have to keep introducing something new into a line because if you don't, it becomes weak. And I dealt with trying to, I had a rule when I sold queens. Anybody who bought a queen from me could get their money back or get a new queen if they just told me, your queen is no good. If they said there was a problem with that queen, I didn't want to sit there and argue with them about, well, what did you do? Why, if it, I used to use the term, if it has a bone in its nose and a spear in its tail, I'd replace it. And my wife said, you can't use that terminology anymore. That's bad. It's not political to use that term. So here it is. It's been 10 years since she told me that, and this is the first time I've used it. But quite frankly, a person who is selling queens should realize that they could be better off just offering to find out from their customers what's going wrong with the queens you buy, because your customers can tell you there's a problem somewhere. And that is really pretty good, because I used to go to a lot of bee meetings, and I never wanted to go to a bee meeting and somebody say to me, your queen doesn't mount a blank, blank, blank. And I think all of us have a certain amount of pride, and our customers realize when we're actually trying to help them.
Agreed. Ellie's got a question. What would be the ideal distance to separate your hives by?
Ideal distance, according to Tom Seeley, spread them out a mile apart. That's not ideal. I can't keep bees like that. I've got 17 hives of bees sitting on a farm that is somewhere in the neighborhood of 1,500 acres. I could probably spread my bees out one hive to an acre, something like that. I'm going to have to do something. To be realistic, and I'm not going to be flippant about it, my bees, I think I'm going to change them so that we're not lined up in a row, stagger them, paint my entrances, which I don't have painted right now. That might be more practical for me with 17 hives of bees. If I had one or two hives, I probably would move one hive to one side of the yard and one hive to the other side of the yard. At least do something, because I know when you have 4 inches between bottom boards, there's a lot of drifting and a lot of possibility for the spread of disease.
And Anthony has a question. Dana, could you talk about your philosophy for mentoring? Nowadays, it's hard to get mentors or members to become mentors and mentees, not to expect what the mentor will become in their personal beekeeper.
Well, first of all, as a mentor, it's not my goal to keep people's bees for them. If they, generally speaking, I limit it to 5. And what I do with my 5 people is we sit down together before, and usually they're all brand new beekeepers. Here in Wake County, we kind of take an area, and then we ask people who want to be mentors in that area. And when I get to 5, I'm done, because that's all I can take care of. And of course, I like to do this because I learn a lot from new beekeepers. But let me answer that question. A mentor should be able to visit a hive on the property of the student, should be able to discuss with that person the rudimentary things about how to approach the hive, how to smoke the hive, talk about smoker fuel, things of that sort, and make sure they get a good start, and make sure that they have protective equipment. My big mistake is I don't use too much protective equipment. I don't wear gloves. I walk around sometimes without my bee veil on. They get that idea that they can do the same thing. They learn. That's not really a wise thing to do, because I get stung when I go in the bee yard. I'm very picky about how they put their hives together. I like to have new beekeepers start with wax foundation. Simply put, bees will work wax foundation much better than they will plastic foundation. And a lot of people are buying kits that only have 9 frames in them instead of 10. And so what I do is insist upon 10 frames. And we have a little workshop in my garage where we sit down and we wire frames and we put some wax in. Now they go to a 1-day bee school here in Raleigh, which doesn't really do that. They talk about equipment. They talk about, well, there's a difference in frames, whether you're using plastic or whether you're using natural wax foundation. They supposedly go home and then they buy their equipment. We try to take those people that are being mentored and let them know you can pick one or the other. It's up to you, but let's do it right. We don't want to see foundation in a hive that's used those pins and your foundation is not straight and even. We'd like to see it wired. You don't have that problem with plastic foundation, but again, if they want plastic, we talk to them about double coating it, putting 2 coats of wax on it, because the bees will draw that better than just a plastic frame. And sometimes they don't even know whether they need to have it waxed, which we talk to them about. As far as management of the hive, the 5 kind of visit each other, and we can see most people recommend that every new beekeeper start with 2 hives. It's not really necessary. If you've got 5 people in a little group, they all know each other. We get a chance to visit each other's bee yards. We get a chance to see what the progress of a hive of bees is. I also belong to a 5-county beekeeper group here in North Carolina, and they have a club bee yard. Wake County has one too, but with 500 members, it's hard to really work with new beekeepers in any group setting. But we talk about the normal progress that a hive of bees has. We talk about recognizing the queen, what kind of queen you have as quickly as you can, because if the queen is bad, you need to do something about it. And by the time we get to fall, our goal is not to get honey the first year. Our goal is to make that hive survive the winter. And it does take a lot of honey. You know, I have people who get a super honey that first year, and they want to have that honey. And quite frankly, we encourage them to keep it for the bees.
Agreed. And I'm the same way with that thought mentality. If my queens don't cut it, off with her head.
Yep.
Anthony do you agree with the regulation that mandates that veterinarians has to inspect and write a prescription for the EFB, AFB antibiotic treatment?
I'm going to answer that question. I see commercials selling chickens down here that are antibiotic and seem to say that, okay, everything's great because we're not using biotics, terramycin and so forth in our hives. I've been on the commercial end where terramycin was bought in 50-pound bags, just like you'd buy a 50-pound bag of sugar. And that terramycin would be mixed with powdered sugar. You can buy powdered sugar in 50-pound bags as well. And cups full of powdered sugar spread across the top bars, not just a little bit, but a lot. Way overused. I mean, we ended up using antibiotics to the point that bacterial diseases and so forth developed a resistance to the chemical. And the threat of this being in our food source has been the big thing. So I would have to say I agree that I don't know about going to a veterinarian, but certainly the fact that you just can't go out and buy these products without a prescription today. There are other ways to treat diseases. Chalk brood is a queen replacement issue for me. European foul brood is usually like a big cold for a hive of bees. And in an emergency situation, I really might think about depopulating the hive rather than combine it with another hive and spread the disease. Maybe I would wait and see if they can get over it on themselves. With American foul brood, boy, I'm telling you, I've had enough experience with American foul brood as a commercial beekeeper that if you start spreading frames, selling nukes or whatever, you cause 1/8 of a big problem. And the best thing a commercial beekeeper can do is burn those hives. You can melt the wax down and recover some things, but certainly I've got no problem with a beekeeper having to get a prescription in order to use the chemical.
All right. Before this next question, we're going to put on the poll. and I'm asking you some things for OSBA about this presentation, the length of it. Would you recommend this? Did you enjoy this type of education? Did you know that we have a YouTube channel that has all this stuff on? And just overall, are you an OSBA member? So, Mr. Dana, a question: can you tell the difference you see between between and out in the sun hive and a hive that's been in the woods?
I sure can. Uh, I Let me tell you that we tell new beekeepers to face your hives facing south. Um, Bees that are in woods are sheltered from the sun, maybe an hour or so before the bees actually start flying. I can use my bees I have in the backyard very easily. I've got 9 hives back there, 5 of them facing south and 4 facing north. And the bees that are facing south, the sun hits the entrances and they are flying well before the bees that are facing north. Now, they're both setting kind of in an area where the sun strikes the hives. So anything that warms the front of that hive will cause the bees to fly earlier. And theoretically, I suppose they could harvest more honey.
Galaxy 10 says, Dana, I believe it was Dave Bush who opted in that sugar syrup was better and easier and better for the bees than overwintered honey. Why do you disagree?
Okay. There was a study carried out at the University of Minnesota where 2 groups of bees, one was a test group and another was a group treated with only sugar syrup. They start out with package bees. I think they used 5 hives in one group, 5 hives in another group. And the group that they were testing with the sugar syrup were put on new foundation and fed only sugar syrup. The bees in the test group were on drawn comb with honey stores. You can guess what the results were. The bees in the test hives did well. The hives that were being studied, all 5 of them had much less brood, where individual bees lived for a shorter period of time. And the conclusion that they drew basically said bees getting natural pollen and honey had a better diet and were healthier than the bees fed only sugar syrup. And of course, the lack of pollen making the bees go out and get their own pollen, the bees were not treated with pollen patties. So that probably would have been a factor involved. But I always kind of think of that as, bees do need the pollen and they do need the value of honey that has, if you look at a sample of honey, you'll find pollen in a sample of honey. And it's far better. No question in my mind. The only thing that I see in the industry is there are a lot of people who harvest honey, and their argument is honey's more valuable. I can put sugar back into that hive to replace the honey and make myself some money. And I really don't think it's doing the bees much good.
Rona has a question. Do you think the use of drone comb as a part of the Varroa management may be reducing the quality and or amount of drones available for queen mating? Excellent question.
Yeah, I like that question. I'm going to go back to Tom Seeley. Tom Seeley said one of the big problems is we are, in our managed hives, we are using foundation that doesn't have any drone brood in it. And in a native nest, about 30% of the comb is going to be drone comb. And he seems to point out that our management practices as far as using hives and getting rid of drones is a bad policy. Now, putting drone comb into a hive I like to raise queens. And when I raised queens, I didn't go out and buy the green plastic foundation to raise drones. It's very easy to get the bees. Just give them a starter strip, put a frame into a hive, and if they need drone comb, they'll belt it.
Galaxy.
And by the way, that has another advantage. You can cut that drone comb out, melt it down in a wax melter, and let them draw a new comb. And you are accomplishing, I don't know what people say. They say, put it into a freezer, freeze the drone, then put it back in. Well, that might allow the bees to go in if they're hygienic, clean up the old drone that's died, the brood that's in that frame, and reuse the cells. But in my particular case, I just put it into a solar wax melter and let everything just melt down, and it's the easy way. Bees will repair that damage.
Yep, and another good way to do that, if you're using deeps, is to put a medium frame in, and on that underside, that gap, they'll turn around, put drones all in it. You can just take your hive tool, slice it off, throw it in the freezer, and then pull that apart. As a county inspector, pull that apart and see if you find any mites.
Yep, that's a real good idea. In fact, that's better than putting in a starter strip.
Dana, why do you prefer 10 frame over 8 frames, especially for younger elderly? I'm not getting any younger.
I was brought up with 10 frame. I've got too many hives to worry about. Does this hive cover fit that hive? If you have 8 frame hives and everything is the same, I mean, you've standardized your beekeeping to just 8 frame hives, there's no difference. I would say the advantage of an 8 frame hive, a lot of 8 frame hives are used in pollination. You can take that hive to pollination and you get more hives on a truck. The other option is if you are up here, as I am, you don't have as much weight to carry around. But I see a lot of garden hives that are 8 frame hives are really cute. For a hobbyist, it might be the best choice.
Exactly. Joel has a question. What about layhens hives? They're much deeper and they help the bees and make lighter for the beekeeper.
Now, layhem hives.
Layhem. Okay. I apologize.
No, I'm not really too familiar with them. I have seen down here something on the order of the old Daydan hive. I don't know whether you remember the Daydan Deep, which is a frame about 11 inches deep. I'm talking about a hive I don't know much about, so I'm not going to make any statements about it, but I can tell you that the deeper you make your hives, the frames and the comb in them, the greater the chance that they're going to be fragile, somewhat not as structurally sound as a regular 9 frame deep, a regular Langstroth deep frame would be. I spent a lot of time with these new beekeepers that don't even think you need to wire your frames. Spent a lot of time with people who think, well, I'm going to get a top bar hive and I can belt everything myself and just put a little starter strip in there and boy, I'll be in the beekeeping business. Well, that's up to them. I don't have any criticism of that, but I'm glad I'm not the bee inspector that has to come around, pull that frame out of their hive and not do any damage to it, because if you take a frame from a top bar hive that's full of honey and you turn it sideways, the darn thing will fall right off.
And I started as a mentor, or my mentor is Dwight Wilson. So you're very familiar with him.
Very familiar. Right?
Dwight, when I first started working with him, I considered them super deeps. That's what I used to call them, but they get to be hard to handle that when they're full of honey and you're moving them around. Yeah. So they quickly disappeared.
Yeah. Well, the old Daydan hive was a 12 frame hive with deep frames.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah. Can you imagine picking something like that up? And you know why it's not around anymore.
130 pounds.
Yeah.
At least.
But Charles Dadant was a strong believer in that particular size of hive.
Oh my gosh.
Of course, I do want to point out, with a size of hive like that, you didn't have two brood chambers. You just had one brood chamber and then a queen excluder and then honey supers above.
Okay. Beatrice has a good statement with this, and along with Dana, and I agree with this as a county inspector. She says, I'm a veterinarian and a beekeeper. I think antibiotics need to be controlled. Resistance is real. It would be great to see more bee education at the vet schools about bee biology, beekeeping, and disease.
Mm-hmm.
So thank you for that statement.
Yes.
We're going to take about a couple more questions. We have one from Ann. What about facing east when the sun rises?
Facing east, as long as the sun comes up in the early part of the year, you'll know that the sun comes up and then it moves more to the west, if I can put it that way. I used to live in the country and I had a window that looked south. And when I marked the window, I'd put marks on where the sun was coming up on the horizon almost every morning. And I'm sorry, I think it was on my right-hand side that the sun raised up more toward the west. But it reaches overhead. And if you turn your hives looking east, you have to wait a little while for that sun to kind of finally reach the front of the hive. But I don't care what direction you place your hives. If they're exposed to the sun and the sun heats the outside of the hive, the bees will start moving.
All right. And Anthony stated back that the layhen hives are French style, about 14 inches deep. Wow.
Okay.
That's good size. And they say the queen is more productive on them because they don't have to cross over the frame. So they don't have to cross from box to box in it like a double deep.
Yeah. And that was Charles Dadant's philosophy as well.
All right. Thank you, everybody. I want to thank Mr. Dana Stahlman for taking the time this evening. And it's my honor and privilege because he grew up in Defiance. Of all 88 counties in Ohio, just below me in Defiance County is Paulding, where Stollers are at. I had the opportunity when I first became a beekeeper to work with Stollers and go out with Dwight, and that's my mentor. And then, so we grew up on the same thing, and then knowing that he went to college right here in Defiance County. So, or Defiance College, excuse me.
Well, I have a place in my heart for that part of Ohio, but I have lived in Eastern Ohio and I've lived in the central part of Ohio, and feel like I know the state pretty well. And there's quite a difference in Ohio beekeeping from Cincinnati all the way up to Toledo. And those of you who live in the north, best advice I can give you is wait a couple weeks before you get your packages. Don't get the early ones.
Absolutely. So I want to thank everybody tonight for showing up. Again, you can go to the Ohio State Beekeepers website, drill down to education, scroll down to Ohio State or Ohio Live Webinar Training, and you can see the speakers that are coming up. Jamie Ellis will be here January 24th. So please go on the Eventbrite that you were on there tonight. You can click on that, get your ticket, and then you'll see the counter that is counting down. So 13 more days and 22 hours, and we'll have Jamie Ellis here talking to you the same way. So thank you, everybody. Thank you, Mr. Stahlman. I greatly appreciate you taking the time this evening and educating us and in this whole grand scheme that we're all in this beekeeping together.
Well, thank you, Jamie.